Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. It's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg Radio, satellite radio channel 121, on YouTube, where you can find us by searching Bloomberg Business News Live, and now on Bloomberg Originals. Welcome to the most original political program on the radio. We're going to do this every day from now on. It's a great honor to be on Bloomberg Originals, and glad if you're finding us right now for the first time that you're part of our conversation every day here in Washington. How about the next 100 days? Well, we're in them now. And our friend Cliff Young at Ipsos has been running numbers here, knowing that things got a little bit deeper. The waters got a bit deeper for President Trump, as I mentioned on Friday with that Moody's downgrade. There are a lot of questions going forward here, not only about tariff policy, but what happens to tax policy and who's going to pay for it on Capitol Hill, right? One big, beautiful bill that could add trillions to the debt and deficit if we don't get the pay-fors that many are asking for, that Moody's is looking for, along with, Fitch and S&P. We heard from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, this morning in an early briefing at the White House. Here's what she said.
The world has confidence in the United States of America and our economy once again. Oil prices are dropping, gas prices are dropping. The president has added nearly 500,000 jobs to the American economy already. So there's a lot of optimism in this economy, and the president disagrees with that assessment.
Yes, cautious optimism, according to Ipsos. The next 100 days, friction, uncertainty, but cautious optimism, writes Cliff Young, who is with me right now, Ipsos Public Affairs President for the U.S. It's great to see you. Welcome back, as always.
It's great to be here, Joe.
You've got the benefit of a slightly longer view than those of us who are in each wrinkle as we wait for the headline on when the phone call is going to end and so forth. Broadly speaking, despite all the stuff I just said, the president's actually doing better in approval ratings than he was weeks ago.
Yeah, he's in a better place. If you look at Ipsos numbers or the average of all the polling firms out there, all the polling numbers, he's improved a point or two since, let's say, the beginning of the month. And I think that has a lot to do with him stepping off the gas a bit.
Interesting.
He was creating a lot of friction around the edges. He was confronting conventions and norms. People don't like that. They're worried, obviously, about potential inflation linked to tariffs. And all that has sort of tampered down a bit.
Interesting that this may have coincided with his pulling back on China for a bit, right? We'll give that a breather, maybe an agreement in principle, whatever we go home thinking, reciprocal tariffs under review. What happens, though, when that review ends and maybe some of this stuff kicks back in?
Well, it's going to be ultimately about whether there's negative impact in people's day-to-day lives. Right now, it's all noise.
Yeah.
It's news. It's not concrete, right? And people are worried about that. Public opinion's worried about that. But we really won't see the impact, if there's going to be an impact, until it affects, if it does affect, people's ability to make ends meet.
Give me a reality check on this Moody's headline, because at Bloomberg, that's a big deal. 10 years back above 4.5%. You say, oh my God, the market's going to tank. It's not, clearly. And I wonder what people really think of this. Does a Moody's downgrade to AA1 mean anything to somebody who's trying to figure out how to pay the bills this month?
No, not at all. They don't know what it even is, right? Ultimately, these are things that elites and bankers and people in Wall Street and people that run companies are worried about, less so about someone in trying to make ends meet, putting food on the table. But ultimately, it runs in part counter to what we're seeing in public opinion. Like we said before, we're in a period of a lull. There is trepidation, there is unease about the present, but there are glimmers of hope looking forward for people.
I'm fascinated by the push and pull when it comes to tariffs based on what you found. Americans do not see the near-term benefit of tariffs. Americans do, however, see the long-term benefits, but are split on whether the pain is worth it. How do we rationalize that?
Well, they're worried about things today, right? Like I said before, there's a lot of trepidation and unease, and it doesn't matter the poll, the question, the indicator, we see it in a general sense. When we talk about the potential benefit of tariffs, generation of jobs, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., a majority of Americans say, yes, I can see where tariffs make sense. I'm in favor of that. but I'm not quite sure I want to suffer the pain needed to get there.
Doesn't that say more about our society, the way that we look at things? Like, hey, I know it's going to pay off, but I'm not sure I'm actually willing to pay it.
Yeah, I think most people need to think in the short term. They need to think about how to make ends meet. They need to worry about how much money is left over at the end of the month, and that's just an indicator of that.
Incredible. As we wait to hear from the president on this phone call with Vladimir Putin, you find that Republicans are still being seen stronger on immigration, on the economy, on inflation, and yes, foreign policy. Are people paying attention to wars on the other side of the world?
Not much. I mean, they're really worried about immigration on the one hand, the cost of living on the other, and Republicans are strong on those points. Trump is strong on those points, and they have been historically. Foreign policy, less so. They get good marks, that is, Republicans do, but people are much less worried about what's going on in the Ukraine or in the Middle East, and much more worried about how to make ends meet.
Right, absolutely. And I guess we're going to be hearing more about this now. When it comes to messaging, there's been a big question about the way this White House is flooding the zone, as they say. I think you're suggesting that maybe things are improving because the zone isn't quite so flooded, the cadence that we've seen. But the messaging around inflation specifically, talking about kids not being able to have as many toys, was one that kind of was hung around the president's neck here. Scott Bessent over the weekend suggesting that maybe Walmart needs to eat some of this, as the president said in a Truth Social post. It's been impacting the soft data, as we say. Consumer sentiment, consumer expectations. We have yet to see it really creep into the hard data. But you're a pollster. You're an expert on this. Do you have a sense of at what point people lose patience? The honeymoon period ends.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise once again. And like I said before, there's a pessimism about the present. We have seen some sort of behavioral change among households. They've cut some sort of non-essential expenditures like travel, and they are stockpiling on some essentials. We've seen that. But this is all, once again, theoretical.
Yeah, right.
This is about the future that hasn't gotten here yet, hasn't arrived. And it really will be about whether it affects Americans' ability to make ends meet, and we're not there yet.
Well, now to the comedy part of the program with Cliff Young. Americans want the president to work with Congress rather than issue executive orders. I'm not sure if they've been paying attention, but that's not going to be the plan coming out of this White House, is it?
Yeah, I don't think we should take it literally. We should take it sort of conceptually. Okay. In other words, Americans want less friction. They want their leaders to follow the rules. They don't like it when they're thwarted. There's been a lot of that. A lot of that. And that's why, why he dropped in the numbers. That's why he outstripped the historical average for the first 100 days. He was at 6-point decline versus a 3-point decline.
These were the DOGE executive actions or any
all
of
of them all
yeah.
together, right? And that's what, and today what we're seeing a bit, as you've already said, Joe, is him stepping off the pedal a bit. I think the numbers are improving a bit because there's less of that friction of that contest going on in public opinion's mind.
Does it help to see the president being presidential, as they say, on a trip like he just took to the Middle East? Not a heck of a lot of news other than some investments in technology, some of the other things that he was talking about, but it was mainly a big photo op. They put a music video together at the White House to post this, being seen with leaders, not just political leaders, but business leaders out there doing things in a forum that nobody else could do. Is there actually a benefit in 2025 to those kind of optics? Yeah,
on the margins, it's important to see our leaders
people get pretty jaded,
our presidents act presidential.
Yeah.
And I think these sorts of initiatives, activities, actions go to seeing public opinion tamper down a bit. It won't have a huge impact, but it does have an impact.
At some point, this is going to start feeding into midterms. I don't know when you start paying attention to that, but we've already got people talking about it here on the air. We had the chair of the DCCC on just a couple of weeks ago talking about strategy, talking about special elections where we're trying to read tea leaves. Has this begun already, or is it too early?
Well, the season's begun, but it's probably starting too early.
Yeah.
I don't like to look at things.
Is the polling season?
No, we're far off still. Yeah. Really November, December is when we begin to look. Listen, typically the party out of power does better in the midterms. Normally, the party out of power, the Democrats, in this case, gain seats in the House, typically take back the House.
Sure.
That's probably going to be the trend, at least. The Democrats probably will trend better. But let's see where we are, especially with this
I know, we've
administration
got
going into next year.
multiple lifetimes between now and then, but I'm always pushing it here. What are your clients asking you about? People should know that Cliff Young doesn't just sit here and talk to guys like me. You're actually out interfacing with clients on a granular level, running numbers like the ones we're talking about. What's the most important question you're getting at the moment?
You know, they want to understand the contours of the future. Not necessarily what's going to happen.
Nothing easy about
but
that.
what can we expect, right? I think, you know, at this point, a lot of our charge, a lot of our sort of objective, or my objective, is to say, listen, things are not as bad as you think they are. Trump is actually in a better place than many believe. Public opinion is worried today, but there are glimmers of hope looking forward. Just those two statements is a way to sort of understand the contours of what will happen.
Interesting. That is only, we're on to the next 100 days, as you pointed out at the top of your deck. That's only, 100 days plus into the administration. Will they start caring less at a certain point? When does this get boring?
No, I think with this administration,
never.
And this politician and this president, never. Yeah.
That says a lot. Job security for Cliff Young.
Yeah. Good for business.
It's good for business, so keep coming back to see us. From Ipsos, Cliff Young, live in Washington. I'm Joe Mathieu. Thanks for being with us here on Balance of Power. We've got a lot more ahead, including our panel. They're back together today, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis with us after a late night on Capitol Hill. We're going to take a look a little bit later on at the legislation that's moving here on the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. Also news about Joe Biden, as you likely heard over the weekend, a cancer diagnosis that has Washington reacting today, and we'll get some insights from our panel on this going forward. Still waiting for the high sign on the call. Trump and Putin, with a lot of news likely to flow from the White House after they get off the horn together talking about Ukraine. We'll have much more on that straight ahead here on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg Radio, on YouTube, and now on Bloomberg Originals. This is Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Big question marks on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. We are, by the way, still waiting for a readout from the White House on President Trump's call earlier today with Vladimir Putin. Moscow saying it went over 2 hours and that it was a very useful call for Vladimir Putin. We'll get the take here from the U.S. side of that call, hopefully shortly. But we're also waiting for news on Capitol Hill just hours after, yes, still only hours after the Budget Committee in the House cleared what the president calls the One Big Beautiful Bill. This is the tax and spend bill that includes the Trump tax cuts and the rest. Several members of the House Freedom Caucus, Kailey, voted present. And this is an issue because they also sit on the Rules Committee. It could come up the works a lot this week. One of them, named Chip Roy, we talk about him a lot here, Republican member of Congress, says the legislation still does not yet meet the moment.
Yeah, so we could consider their present votes last night as being an upgrade from their no votes on Friday, but it is no guarantee that there'll be yes votes either in the Rules Committee, in the case of Chip Roy or Ralph Norman, or if this thing actually gets to the floor at the end of the week, remembering that Republicans, with their very narrow majority, can afford to lose roughly 3 votes. And there are 4 who have serious problems just on the conservative side, not to mention the SALT members and the moderate members who have issues with the SALT cap and Medicaid cuts, respectively.
And the more Speaker Johnson does to alleviate concerns of the Freedom Caucus, the more likely he is to offend moderates and get more no votes to worry about. So it's a really delicate balancing act here, and it's one that probably feels pretty familiar for the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, probably pretty familiar for our panel as well, as they've seen a few of these. Let's turn to them. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, of course, Republican strategist and Stone Court Capital partner. Jeannie, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, to the point that Joe was just making about Johnson trying to appease members of the Freedom Caucus, the more that he gets pulled to the right, does that not only risk that he can actually get this thing out of the House, but even if he can and it goes to the Senate, that everything he agrees to gets reversed by the upper chamber?
Well, we can now say that this is not Johnson's first rodeo. We couldn't say that last year, but we could say it this year. I mean, and he's been pretty adept at, sort of piecing together coalitions with the Freedom Caucus and at the same time holding his sort of left flank of the Republican caucus in check. I would say that the aggressive nature of the SALT caucus probably through the cheerleading of Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, has really bolstered their side of the equation. It probably made life a little tougher for Johnson. But that being said, I think really the biggest thing that's happened this week outside of the vote last night was the Senate basically saying, "Hey, look, guys, we're not going for any of this stuff. We're gonna change the Medicaid cuts. You can fight about it all you want, but it's not going to matter once you get here." And that does let a lot of air out of the tire. I mean, when the House sees that and they're like, "What am I fighting over? This is just going to get changed." So it does take a little wind out of the sails. They'll be fighting hard to get what they want out of these, cuts in that budget they're trying to make. And they have made a promise not to raise the government debt, which they're not going to be able to keep. There's just no way this goes to term without adding to the deficit. So these guys are going to be disappointed. Now the question is, how much noise are they going to make before they're totally disappointed?
Boy, well, I don't know about your cheerleading here, Jeannie, but it's hard to deny the sticky situation that Speaker Johnson is in. What role are the SALT Republicans, let's say the delegation from your state specifically in New York, potentially going to play to complicate this further, because they still do not have a deal on raising the cap?
They absolutely do not. And by the way, can I just say, I know producer James never makes a mistake, but when I got the email this morning saying the meeting for rules was at 1 a.m., I thought, mistake by James. It's got to be 1 a.m. And of course, he was totally right. Never happens. In terms of, the problem is just what's been laid out, which is, of course, that the more Mike Johnson appeases the far right, the House Freedom Caucus, the more upset the folks from my area get, the SALT caucus, as you will. And then there's also the other folks. You were just talking about the Medicaid folks who are concerned, like Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania, about cuts there. And then, of course, the old story that if this gets passed in the House, the Senate is going to take it, totally rewrite it, and try to jam the House. And then we're really going to have to see, do these folks buckle under pressure from Donald Trump? They've done it before. They may do it again. But some of this rhetoric about one bill, this is the big, beautiful bill, it's all you get, it makes it seem like if they don't get their piece of this in there, they're not going to get anything. So this is really, really tough for the House. I think they are going to get jammed by the Senate, and how they react is going to be the big question.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating conversation on the late edition of Balance of Power, Kailey. We're going to be spending some time with Andrew Clyde, the Republican from Georgia, one of the four we've been talking about here, who has great trouble with this bill. Yeah. I don't know if he's been getting phone calls from Donald Trump or what actually is going to end up happening here.
We'll ask.
We will ask him. Rick, what changes between now and the Rules Committee, if anything? And is this just a silly exercise with everything that you just mentioned about the Senate? They're going to get together at 1 o'clock in the morning to try to hammer something out in rules when the Senate is sitting there waiting to change the whole thing?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. Look, I mean, the Rules Committee has a tricky job of piecing together all these different committee reports. So they'll add it all up. They'll figure out what they got to do to shave a little here and there. And they'll tweak some things. Maybe they'll tweak the SNAP program coming out of agriculture. They'll tweak, some more facets of the tax cuts, specifically SALT, to try and buy in those votes. And so, the rules have actually got quite a bit of juggling they've got to do to get members comfortable enough, at least in the committee. And as you point out, Kailey, you've got Ralph Norman and Chip Roy, sitting on that committee. They weren't there a year ago. They demanded to be put on there as a part of the exchange of cooperation to get Johnson as Speaker. And now he's going to really regret having those rabble-rousers in the Rules Committee.
Fun.
Well, especially when those rabble-rousers perhaps have more ammunition from a ratings agency. Moody's, of course, downgrading the U.S. credit rating on Friday, taking a lot of us by surprise. But, of course, it was the last rating agency standing that still had the U.S. rated the highest possible grade. Of course, the downgrade, in part blamed on successive administrations and Congress not doing enough to address the deficit and the interest costs of the United States. This is something that Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, was asked about by our own Tyler Kendall at the White House earlier today, and this was his response.
I think that American bonds are the best buy in the world, and they're going to be even better buy once all of our policies are in place. And this downgrade is something that happened because of the runaway spending of the previous administration. They were the last agency to move, and I don't think it should be a surprise to markets.
Like we saw with the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, on Sunday shows, Jeannie, he's looking at casting blame backwards. Bessent suggested that Moody's is really a lagging indicator, that this is about past behavior, not necessarily the behavior of this administration. To what extent is that a makeable argument, given that this is active legislation we are talking about here that can add trillions of dollars to the very deficit Moody's is concerned about?
Yeah, it was interesting. A few times on the Sunday shows, Bessent was saying, look, Larry Summers says this, we don't always agree, but it's a lagging indicator. And the reality is that there is so much blame to go around for where we find ourselves in terms of debt and deficit. And so, yes, you can look back at the previous administration. But what was the administration before that? Oh, it was Donald Trump's, which added an enormous amount to the deficit. And before that, Barack Obama. I mean, we have a deficit that has now gotten us downgraded by all three. And, you frequently talk to people from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They're talking about this bill alone adding 3.3 trillion to the debt. And, it could even go up as far as 5.2 according to their numbers. That is disastrous for our children and our grandchildren. And Bessent and the rest of the folks in the administration want to say, well, that's going to be offset because we're going to do better with energy. All of that may be true. And yet we still have a debt or deficit, which is going to strangle our grandchildren. And that is a result of irresponsible budgeting on both sides and in all administrations in the modern era. And of course, we're sitting here today talking about potentially a rules meeting at 1 a.m. What happened to regular order and responsible budgeting? Our Congress is not up to it across the board, Democrats and Republicans.
Kind of amazing seeing the lack of reaction in the markets here, Rick. It was hair on fire on Friday night when the Moody's headline dropped. Then we saw the 10-year at 4.5%, 4.5 this morning. And now we've got the S&P 500 up 7 points. If Wall Street doesn't care, will Washington?
Yeah, Washington has different priorities than just Wall Street. I know everybody on Wall Street wants to believe that Washington only reacts to their whims, but there's enough sophistication inside the Beltway to say, hey, you know what? We got to go home. We got to get reelected. And if we add, like Jeannie said, trillions to the deficit, we're going to have a lot of really upset constituents. And on top of that, there are serious issues with some of these entitlement programs that need to be reformed. And there'll be some positive things happen in this effort, but there'll be some damaging things too. And so, those are the things that constituents, that voters care about, and that these members are thinking about much more than Wall Street right now. And I think there's a general consensus that the underlying economy of the United States is sound. That's why you see the robust kind of response today, even on top of the Moody's thing. We're not, dancing on the head of a pin. And so I think that these are the kind of things that members are really upset about, is that they've got to go home and defend some of this stuff. And it's very hard for the many members of the Republican caucus to reconcile each other's ideological differences to be able to get a concerted message through to the voters.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
This just breaking after his 2-hour-long phone call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Trump says he believes it went very well and that Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, in the president's words, an end to the war. He said the conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be because they know the details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. He went on to say that he has so informed Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, other officials in Europe of this, that these negotiations will begin immediately. He also notes, Joe, that the Vatican has stated it would be interested in hosting the negotiations. He ends the post by saying, let the process begin.
Pretty remarkable. And it doesn't sound unlike what we heard from Moscow, save a couple of lines here. For instance, root causes of the war, as we heard from Vladimir Putin. But apparently we are going to the Vatican peace talks, which is something that we had discussed earlier in the process, having been floated by the Pope. J.D. Vance, the vice president, meeting with the Pope again over the weekend here. A ceasefire, however, would need to begin before any real talks could happen. So I'm not sure how the order of events goes here, Kailey, or whether we'll see these two in the same room at some point.
Well, it seems that the president is suggesting negotiations need to happen to get to a ceasefire in the first place. And then you get to the end of the war in a second step. We'd love to hear from our political panel on this. Of course, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino are still with us. Rick, we know this is a White House and a president specifically that it was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Do you really believe he's gotten closer with this 2-hour phone call?
Well, he certainly indicates that he thinks there's a process now that's going to kick off. What's really stark about this is the fact that he doesn't consider the U.S. or his presidency as part of that process. Here's a guy who campaigned for 2 years saying on day one he could resolve this conflict. And now, based on his own tweet or whatever it's called, he's basically saying, I can't get to know all the details of the solution, so we're just going to leave it up to Ukraine and Russia. I don't know who that actually benefits. I would be surprised if it benefits the U.S. because it's good for us to be in the middle of these things to ensure that at the end of the process we're keeping everybody honest with their commitments. But look, I have to be an optimist. This war's gone on too long. That's one thing I agree with Donald Trump on. And whether or not we can trust Russia at this stage after many disappointments, we'll see. But we can be hopeful, and maybe the American Pope has enough magic to sprinkle on this process that we could get something really positive done.
Yeah. Jeannie, the president writing in this post on Truth Social, Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. He says there's a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited, in all caps. I guess I go back to the same questions I was asking when we got Russia's readout on all of this. Are we going to be in a world in which the invader is setting the terms of the ceasefire?
Listening to what Donald Trump has written on Truth Social, I too would like to be optimistic like Rick. I hope that this works. But Donald Trump seems to believe that he can attract people to these deals by talking about the economy and all of those things, which are critically important, obviously, to Russia and all of us. But the reality is what Russia said right after Putin got off this call. What did Putin say? He said the main thing is to eliminate the root cause. And what Putin sees as the root cause of this has nothing to do really with the economy or jobs or transactions like Donald Trump is talking about. For him, the root cause is he believes profoundly that Ukraine is part of Russia. So I'm not sure how this helps us get across that bridge, so to speak. How do you appease Vladimir Putin when it is utterly a non-starter for Zelensky, Ukraine, the West, the United States, that he should get to move into and keep large swaths of Ukraine? Even in the last few hours, talking about parts of Ukraine he hasn't even annexed yet. So I think Donald Trump is being a bit optimistic here, and I'm not so sure they're going to be able to get through, but hopefully I'm wrong and they're able to get this ceasefire going.
Yeah. Going into overtime with our panel. Many thanks again to Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis in the clutch now that we have a White House readout on the meeting between President Trump and Putin, roughly 2 hours in length. It took place a short time ago, beginning around 10:40 a.m. Washington time. And we want to add the voice of Nick Wadhams, who's been in the center of our coverage here when it comes to national security. He runs our U.S. national security team at Bloomberg. Nick, now that we've actually heard from both sides, how are we characterizing this meeting? Is it one that was productive because we don't have a ceasefire? Right. And it doesn't appear that the president of the United States will be deeply involved in these talks from here.
Right. I mean, I think for Europe and for members of Congress who have supported sanctions, this is going to be a disappointing readout in some ways, because what it looks like is President Trump is hopeful that there's going to be progress, that there is going to be some sort of outcome. But so far, Vladimir Putin hasn't committed to anything. I mean, we've talked in the Truce Social post about negotiations for a ceasefire starting immediately. There have been conversations about a potential ceasefire going on for weeks and weeks, and the idea of a ceasefire does not seem to be all that difficult to do. You just stop the fighting. So I think the initial impression from some of the folks we've spoken to is that you again see a situation where President Putin is looking to string the U.S. along, draw out a process, and keep up the fighting in Ukraine.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that we did see talks in Turkey between Russian and Ukrainian officials, though they were quite low level. Vladimir Putin, of course, himself did not show up. Zelensky was willing to meet with him, but wasn't going to go if Putin did not attend. So even as the president says, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations, how much does it matter, Nick, who exactly it is that's showing up to the table?
Right. I mean, a lot of questions about who they would send and who is empowered to actually make commitments from the Russian side, for example, but also what is the true interest and outcome from Russia? Do they actually want to stop the fighting? I mean, based on the events of the last couple of days, no. It was a massive drone barrage in Kyiv over the weekend, very deadly and one of the most intense in many months. So they are determined, it looks like, to continue the fighting. I mean, the issue you see here is one where Vladimir Putin, it would almost be in his interest to play for time, because you have a lot of unresolved questions about where Ukraine's munitions and weapons are going to come from next. Are they going to come from the U.S.? Is Donald Trump willing to send more weaponry, push another supplemental through Congress? In a lot of ways, Vladimir Putin can say, we're just going to keep doing this till you guys run out of weapons and munitions, and then you're going to be in a weaker position to negotiate.
Vladimir Putin's got his own audience at home. To what extent does it embolden him or help him politically, domestically, to appear to be stringing along the United States?
Well, I mean, it does help him. I mean, to have this conversation with Donald Trump, there's a lot of concern. What he really wants is that one-on-one, mano-a-mano, equal time with Donald Trump, and that's certainly what he gets here. And then you see a truth from the president that, at the very least, is not negative.
We're going to
towards
be trading
Vladimir
partners
Putin.
again.
I mean, is saying basically he's, let's get this done. This is a big deal. They're on equal terms. There is no criticism or pressure or leverage being exacted on the Russians, and crucially, no mention of sanctions. So it doesn't feel, from what the limited readouts we've had so far, that President Putin is under much pressure at all.
Yeah, in fact, President Trump describing the conversation, the tenor of the conversation, as being excellent. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. He said, if it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. Read into that how you will. But to your point, Nick, on no mention of sanctions in this post, is this a testament to the threat of sanctions, which President Trump said he was willing to impose? Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary today, said everything would be on the table in that regard if Russia isn't playing ball the way the administration wants. Is this a testament to sanction threats working or not?
Well, I mean, very initial impressions here, of course, but to me it is a suggestion that President Trump does not believe the sanctions threat is necessary. I mean, he seems to be signaling that there's progress here. They're moving in the right directions. He's not going to want to spoil that with a potential announcement on sanctions. He's not saying progress or else. He's just saying, hey, we're doing it. These guys, the process is launched, and suggesting that his phone call with President Putin is the reason why the process has begun, when, of course, there have been conversations back and forth via intermediaries and then directly, as you mentioned, in Turkey by Russia and Ukraine, but so far, no ceasefire.
What do you make of the Vatican involvement here? I have to admit, it smacks of the optics that you would think Trump would really like.
Sure. I mean, I think at
does
this
it add
point,
to the drama or the urgency around this? What does it bring to the conversation?
I mean, in the theory of throw spaghetti against a wall and see what sticks, why not? I mean, the UN has been essentially discredited and frozen because of the clash in the Security Council between the U.S. and Russia. There is some concern about, if the U.S. is the mediator, whose side are they really on, as evidenced by President Trump's Truce. So if you have a truly disinterested / impartial venue, the Vatican, why not? Let's give it a shot. New pope, new day. Maybe there is a way under which you could get the parties in a room together and there might be slightly less mistrust. I don't know. I mean, it's just another notion that's out there that in the past you wouldn't have even heard about, I think. But in this sort of radical transparency where President Trump just broadcasts everything from Truth, now we have to contend with it. I don't think anyone really has much idea what that means right now.
Well, amazing.
And finally, Nick, President Trump gives a number of specific shout outs in this post to people he spoke with after speaking with Vladimir Putin on a phone call. Vladimir Zelensky, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, the presidents of France, the prime minister of Italy, the chancellor of Germany, the president of Finland. How important is that everybody got together, all of the allies of Ukraine, if you will, spoke immediately after he got off the phone with Russia?
Well, I mean, the question is what was actually in those conversations and what was the tenor? I mean, the European leaders are deeply uneasy with President Trump having this one-on-one call with Vladimir Putin. They just say, for one thing, there's no need, and it would seem to serve Putin's purposes of splitting the U.S. away from Europe. So we're really going to need to see what came from those calls. If President Trump went to those and said, okay, don't worry, if we don't see progress by such and such a date, we're going to impose sanctions, well, that's one thing. If you went to them and said, go stuff it, we're going for this thing, progress is continuing, but out, a much different. They're trying to telegraph unity there, but it's hard to tell if that goes any deeper than the surface.
All right. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams leading our national security team here in Washington as we grapple with this breaking news. Thank you so much. Again, President Trump providing the readout of his 2-hour-long phone call with Vladimir Putin on Truce Social, saying that Russia and Ukraine will start ceasefire talks immediately, describing as a process beginning, even though the U.S. had already been trying to broker a ceasefire, granted through bilateral negotiations separately with Russia and Ukraine rather than Russia and Ukraine directly talking, but 4 months now, really since he came into office.
Well, that's right. And to your point, just last weekend there was a session that the president of Russia decided not to send his top lieutenants to. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was there. Steve Witkoff was there. And they were dealing with much lower level officials at the table, questioning again the motivations and intentions coming from the Kremlin.
Well, we want to get a read on how Melinda Herring is viewing the Kremlin's intentions and motivations here with what we're reading. She, of course, is senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and is one of the experts we love speaking with on the war in Ukraine specifically. Melinda, welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV Radio and now Bloomberg Originals. I do wonder what's going through your head as we look at the words of President Trump, that negotiations toward a ceasefire and an end to the war will start immediately. Does that fill you with confidence or skepticism?
Hey, Kailey. So, no, it does not fill me with confidence. And I think it's important to not just look at what Trump said, but also to look at what Putin's saying. So let's take a pause for a moment. Putin has grabbed the microphone and he's talking about a memorandum which will outline all the conditions and then maybe there'll be a ceasefire. So I don't have a lot of confidence that this is going anywhere. The Europeans threatened Putin a week ago and said if he didn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire, that there would be massive sanctions, and there was nothing there. So I think this may be a lot of hot air yet again.
Well, you could look at this, I'm sure, a lot of different ways, Melinda. We're waiting for an official readout from the White House, and I don't suspect it'll disagree with what you heard from President Trump. Slightly different, though, than what we did hear from the Kremlin. And when you hear Vladimir Putin talking about getting down to the roots of the invasion, the roots of the conflict, what does that say to you? And is it possible to have negotiations while the fighting continues?
Joe, that's really the question. So Russian demands haven't changed over the last 3 years. And the negotiations broke down in Istanbul on Friday because Russia went back to its demands. And this time it said we must have not only Crimea, but 4 of those oblasts in eastern Ukraine. And they don't completely control those Ukrainian oblasts. And the Ukrainians said, stuff it. So it's hard to see that this discussion is going to move anywhere. It's good that the Vatican's involved. It's good that the Europeans and the Americans are working together. But when Putin talks about intent, he means NATO, and he's blaming Ukraine for insisting on sovereignty as the cause of the war. That's what this coded language is.
Well, Melinda, to your point about Russia wanting the recognition of Ukrainian territory as its own, despite the fact that it does not have many of these areas in its full control, does Russia right now have the military advantage to be able to get those areas under control? I just wonder the strength of each side's position here if they are indeed about to join together at one table for these talks.
So right now, you know that Russia controls Crimea. It illegally annexed that province. But in terms of those 4 other oblasts, they control about 20% of Ukraine, and it depends on the oblast. Russia does have the momentum on its side, but it's very slow going. If you look at the Institute for the Study of Wars report, it's very, very small progress. The Ukrainians are holding the front with drones, but there is an expectation that the Russians are going to make a push this summer. And the expectation from the Russian side is that they're going to be able to take all 4 of those provinces by the end of the year. I think that may be an overstatement, but that's the Russian expectation.
Well, then it sounds like you can't negotiate when you're in the throes of fighting. We just saw one of the biggest drone barrages against Kyiv of the war so far, just in the last 24 hours. Melinda, at what point does the White House lose patience for this?
That's right, Joe. So over the weekend, Russia hit Ukraine with 273 drones across the country, and they want to increase that number. They're trying to overwhelm the Ukrainians' air interceptor system, their air defense system. But you can't negotiate in an ongoing war. So we're all looking for the ceasefire. President Trump has been great on this. He called for a 30-day ceasefire. He's been calling for that for weeks now, and Putin won't agree to it. So I really encourage our viewers to keep your eye on the ceasefire part of this. If he doesn't agree to a ceasefire, there's not going to be any real negotiations. And we see him again stalling for time and talking about, he wants to get into these weedy details, Joe, so that he can delay the ceasefire. And let's go back to Easter. He demanded a 3-day ceasefire right after Easter when he was having this big May Day parade. And he can call his troops off. It's up to him. So when he starts to get weedy, it means that he doesn't want to do something.
Well, and when we consider even just the prospect of a ceasefire beginning, Melinda, what are the enforcement mechanisms or what keeps both sides honest on maintaining that ceasefire? If it's also just the 2 of them at the negotiating table versus having some sort of mediator, what would guarantee that it holds?
That's a great question. In this case, you need an external mediator, and we don't know who that would be. It can't be the OSCE because both Ukraine and Russia are party to the OSCE. So we're going to need some kind of neutral mediator to make sure that once a ceasefire is in place, it can be observed by outsiders and that the rules of the negotiations are very clear. So in this case, we haven't seen the details, and I'm not sure who could do that job capably.
The president writes, Melinda, the Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Are we to believe that the Vatican would be involved on any level of mediation here? What would that mean for talks?
So the Vatican has offered to host negotiations, and the new Pope it feels very different, Joe, than the previous Pope on Ukraine. He's been clear that Ukraine is the victim. And he, both there are quite a few Roman Catholics in the Trump administration, so I think that sort of appeals to them. And we've seen Zelensky also do his big meeting with Trump there at the Vatican. So I think this is a good sign that this could be one of the potential places where the parties can meet and discuss their friction. But, TBD, everyone wants to host these negotiations. Turkey would love to, Qatar would love to, everyone wants credit for the end of the war. So I think we're going to have to stay tuned with that one as well.
Melinda, it's great to have you with us. Melinda Herring, as we learn some of the details of this meeting between the 2 presidents, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We should note, Kailey, that the Truth Social post that we've been describing and reading from by President Trump was sent out by the White House. So we'll call that our official statement. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.